I just wanted to share something I've been reading. This is a really fascinating article called Nietzsche's Value Monism, Saying Yes to Everything by John Richardson. And it is from this very interesting looking book, Nietzsche on Mind and Nature, which is an edited volume with contributions from different writers, philosophers. Some very intriguing titles there. So I'm actually just reading this on Google Books. I don't actually have this book, or at least I don't have it yet. But Google has very generously provided a pretty substantial section from this particular chapter that I'll be reading from, which is wonderful. So the idea here, this value monism, I'll just read a little bit out. The idea of value monism is, for Nietzsche, yes, the radical claim that everything has the same value. For Nietzsche, that value is good, so that everything is good, and indeed even equally good. So rather than the view that power, for example, is the only good, his value monism holds that good is the only value. Everything has this one value. And so this article argues for why this is Nietzsche's view, or it tries to prove that this is in fact Nietzsche's position. And it also talks about how this can be a coherent position, how this makes sense, especially given Nietzsche's other statements, his other apparently contradictory remarks that might go against that. And there's just one particular section that I want to focus on that I'm going to read out because it really, really struck me. And just to provide some context for that, I might have to talk about another section. So basically, when we talk about, let me just find the part. So when we talk about value monism, that's of course distinct from, let's say, ontological monism or being monism, that there's only one thing or there's only one type of thing. For Nietzsche, that's true as well. There's not two different worlds, two different types of being. There's not mind and matter. There's not the earthly and the heavenly. There's just body, or more commonly what he calls life. So this isn't just inert matter. This isn't just mechanistic matter. This is body. It's natural. It's physical, but it's imbued with, let's say, striving. It's imbued with power. It's intentional in that sense. So in that sense, it's somewhat between mind and matter. But that's what he thinks about ontology. This is what he thinks about value. And the two are related, as we'll see. So in these pages, John Richardson is arguing the different ways or the different levels on which Nietzsche is opposed to opposite values. And one of the key ways is because bad and good, good and evil imply each other. They require each other. And specifically within Nietzsche's worldview, within Nietzsche's ontology, this is because life, which again is the only thing that there is, life is inherently overcoming. Life is inherently about growth and about overcoming. And for there to be overcoming, there has to be this bifurcation into good and bad. So, for example, maybe we can read from here. So it's not just that good requires bad in the sense that it requires it for contrast, but good requires bad as an element in itself. Good is always an overcoming of a bad. And one way to think about this is that overcoming means that you find your current situation bad, or something that presently exists bad, and then you have a intention or a vision of what would be good, what would be better, what would be more good, and then you strive to realize that, to bring that into reality, to replace what was bad. And then, of course, that new situation in turn will itself become bad, relatively speaking, and a new good will appear. That's what you're striving to. And then, of course, if you achieve it, that in turn will become bad. And this process repeats and repeats. And it necessarily repeats because life is overcoming. Life is growth. Life is expansion, intensification, all these things. So that's a necessary aspect of life. He also talks about how, though, it is an asymmetric relation between those. So let's see if I can find the particular part where he talks about it, somewhere around here. This is a good quote from Zarathustra, that creating requires destroying. Thus does the highest evil belong to the highest good, but the latter is the creative. Let's see where that's from. Oh, it's quoted there. So that's from Zarathustra, Book 2, Chapter 12. The Dionysian joy in destroying is for the sake of a positive project that makes a new future, the desire for destruction. This is from the Gay Science. For change and for becoming can be the expression of an overflowing energy pregnant with the future. My term for this is as is known, Dionysian. It's Nietzsche again. Here we go. Hence good and bad stand in an asymmetric relation. This is Richardson. The latter is presupposed by, even contained within the former, as what it overcomes. But bad doesn't in the same way contain good. It is not intrinsically a descent from a good. Okay, so I think that's the key point there. There's an asymmetric relationship there because life is oriented towards expansion or overcoming. It's always going to reach towards a better state, and therefore that's going to generate the sense of bad as the current state, as what currently exists. So in that sense, good is primary and bad is secondary, but both are essential in that sense, because you couldn't just have the sense of good and not have the sense of bad, based on what life is intrinsically, right? Granted this conception of ontology. So I think that sets the context well enough. So I want to go down a little bit to this point here, the fourth point or the fourth level at which Nietzsche is opposed to the opposition of values, or opposed to just the idea of opposite values, that there's a good versus bad, a good versus evil. And this is the ultimacy of the good, or the ultimacy of good. Let me see if there's anything that I should read from this paragraph. I mean, this is maybe relevant for those who haven't read much Nietzsche, to sort of point out that this is Nietzsche's orientation towards the world. So in Ecce Homo, which is his kind of autobiography, last book that he wrote, I think, last book that he wrote intended for publication, this final, most joyful, effusive, high-spirited yes to life is not only the highest insight, it is also the deepest, the most rigorously confirmed and supported by truth and science. That's an interesting quote because it implies that his Dionysian affirmative orientation to existence isn't just merely a choice or merely just a leap or a decision to take a certain perspective, but is grounded in something deeper. And that's what John Richardson is trying to argue in this chapter or article. He's trying to argue that there is reason to take this position. So now I'll read this passage. It's not very long. It's about a page, I would say, maybe a bit less. But it's very, very good. Okay, so let me put this metaethical argument in a preliminary way. In the deepest logic of valuing, it is by life, for life. There are values only by virtue of life. Life is only in life's valuing. Oh, and there's something else I should have mentioned for context. For Nietzsche, values are posited by life. So values don't exist in the things themselves. Values are, in that sense, subjective. They are posited by life and put onto things. And that's what makes sense of this sentence here. There are values only by virtue of life. Life is only in life's valuing. From Twilight of the Idols. Life itself values through us when we posit values. Moreover, what life values as good is power. And since power is its own growth, i.e. the more of life itself, the ultimate value is really just life itself. That's crucial as well, I would say. Because this will to power precisely is expansion of life, projection of life into the future. It is life. It is more life. This kind of dynamism or energy of life. And so that's really important to consider here as well. That's what will to power is, or that's what will to power means. At its core, continuing the quote here, at its core, valuing's good is always and simply life. So life as the transcendental condition of all values and as the built-in aim of all values is the ultimate and essential good. So I'll just say a few words about that before I continue. So life is that which posits values. There are no values, at least for Nietzsche, without life. And the aim of life is, again according to Nietzsche, power in the sense of increase, expansion, overcoming, exercise of itself, transformation of reality through itself. All these senses are, what is meant by this idea of power or will to power in Nietzsche. Ultimately, what that comes down to is the aim of life is life. The aim of life is itself. The aim of life is its own expansion through the process of overcoming. Therefore, the condition for all values is life, and the aim of all values is also life. So I hope that's clear, because that's important for the coming argument. And I'm continuing the quote from Richardson. We can fill out this meta-ethical argument by considering Nietzsche's difference from Schopenhauer, who argues to an opposite conclusion from some of the same premises. He emphasizes the negative element in life as will, the way life is the ground of suffering, the way it always involves a judging bad and saying no. Schopenhauer infers that life's fundamental aim is to eliminate the suffering that is essential to itself. So he states the opposite overall valuation of life in its pure and honest form. All life is bad, all goods are merely lesser degrees of bad, including even escape from willing, which is in effect a zero or minimal degree of bad, the best we can do. What is Nietzsche's argument for his more positive stance? If we accept that life is will to power, and that it is always both yes and no, no to life as needing to be overcome, and yes to its overcoming, why take the affirmative judgment as primary? Isn't Schopenhauer just as justified in generalizing from the negative aspect? But Nietzsche insists that the negative aspect is merely an element in a fuller positive project toward growth or the more of life. Schopenhauer has failed to notice how this positive aim contains the negative, how it makes suffering in particular not a bad opposite to good, but a bad that's a necessary part of good. Power is not just the negation of suffering, but an increase that contains suffering as subsidiary part. That might be it. Let me see if there was anything I wanted to quote from the next chapter. Okay. I think it's still worth continuing, but I'll just comment on what I've read. So in a way, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer have the same view, or at least a very similar view, about life as will. Schopenhauer focuses on the necessity for suffering and for disvaluing as a part of that process that we've talked about, that process of overcoming. Life as will is never satisfied. It is always dissatisfied in that Buddhist sense of dukkha, of suffering or dissatisfaction. And so it never can just rest in the state that it's achieved, but wants more and wants something beyond that state. And so for Schopenhauer, he focuses on the suffering aspect of this, the part that says no to the current state, and therefore judges that all life is bad. All life is negative. Nietzsche has a very similar model, a very similar theory, but he draws the opposite conclusion from this. And the way that he does that is by noticing the overall process. Like Richardson says, Schopenhauer has failed to notice how the positive aim contains the negative, how it makes suffering in particular not a bad opposite to good, but a bad that is a necessary part of good. Power is not just the negation of suffering, but an increase that contains the suffering as subsidiary part. So that sense of increasing power, which is, you could say, a joyful experience, necessarily contains suffering. It contains suffering in the disvaluing of the current state. You could also say it contains suffering as the resistance experienced in moving towards the better state. And it always necessarily will do. But at the same time, that expansion that is life is itself joyful. And it's joyful in a way that, precedes and encompasses the necessary suffering. Something like that. So I'll continue reading. This much is a rather abstract argument about some deep conditions of valuing, but Nietzsche wants this argument to lead us to a certain perspective that embodies this insight, this perspective of life itself. A person can occupy this standpoint and value just as life essentially values. What we can say from this perspective is just that life is good. Any distinctions we go on to make will speak for only one kind of life. This will find some life good and other life bad. So below the monist perspective of life itself, there's a value pluralism. There are different goods internally to the different perspectives, but from the point of view that values what's essential to valuing, life is good. And this is a quote from Will to Power, which is a collection of the notes of Nietzsche. So despite controversy involving that book, this is actually written by Nietzsche. In all correlations of yes and no, of preference and rejection, love and hate, all that is expressed is a perspective and interest of certain types of life. In itself, everything that is says yes. Okay. So, and this is me just commentating again, from the perspective of life itself, not just an individual perspective, from that perspective, everything is good. From the perspective of the individual and a particular instantiation of life, then of course you do have, in a sense, you have these, if not opposite values, these values that are in tension. You have, again, the bad, which is the current situation, and the good, that is the situation that you're reaching towards and striving to overcome. And you'll necessarily have those as a particular instantiation of life. But from the perspective of life itself, what can we say? We can only say life itself is good. And to expand on that a bit, what can we say about that? We've seen that life is the condition for valuing, life is the aim of valuing. So when we zoom out and we're talking about life in general and not a specific instance of life, then what can we say about that? Life is always overcoming. Life is always achieving itself. Life is always expressing itself. And in fact, it's expressing itself in all those individual instantiations that are going through the process of overcoming specific situations, of disvaluing specific things and valuing other specific things. But life itself is always engaged in this process. Life itself is always, in that sense, experiencing itself as good, experiencing reality as good, everything as good. Even the necessary no-saying, disvaluing that is part of that process. The strong are good, the weak are good, the powerful, those who lack power, the resentful, those who disvalue life or seem to disvalue life itself. All of this is good. And all of these different types of beings, even those who are consumed by resentment, even those that seem to reject life, at bottom are just expressions of life and are just, again, at bottom, at the deepest level, affirmations of life. And so in that sense, all are good and all are equally good. And then Richardson talks a little bit about Dionysus in this part and how Dionysus inhabits this perspective of life itself, and also some tensions within Nietzsche's work where sometimes Dionysus appears to be outside of life, and how to sort of think about that. And so I'll finish here in this last paragraph here. Nietzsche allows that we can't judge life from outside, but thinks we can judge it from a perspective at the bottom of our own and every other particular instance of life. From this stance, the particular yes and no in each particular case of life willing power drops out. and there is left only life wanting more of itself, without regard to particulars. And usually I think Dionysus is not really exterior to life, but a personification of this standpoint. Dionysus personifies how suffering is taken up into the good that redeems it. And then a quote from Will to Power. God conceived as an emancipation from morality, taking into himself the whole fullness of life's antitheses and, in a divine torment, redeeming and justifying them. God as the beyond and above of the wretched loafer's morality of good and evil. This is the Dionysian vision. This is what Nietzsche is gesturing towards in his work, at least according to Richardson, that everything is good. Life is always sort of achieving, or achieving is maybe the wrong word. Life is always joyful. Life is always engaged in the very thing that is its essence and nature to do, which is to overcome, to expand, to increase this will to power, this joyful will to power, which necessarily involves specific instances of saying no and specific instances of saying yes, but the overall process is one great yes, and there's no position outside of life to make a judgment. That's the other key thing as well. Life is the only thing that values, and life ultimately is the only thing that is valued. So there's no outside position. There's nowhere you can stand to say, yes, but is reality really valuable? Is it not? There's no outside in that respect. And so from the perspective of life, all is, this joyful self-expression, self-expansion, this energy, this energy being generated and expanding and, dancing and so on and so forth. It is a really wonderful and compelling vision. And so that's why I just wanted to share this section of this chapter, and yeah, I welcome, as always, any comments and potential future discussions with people who are maybe interested in the same issues or have their own thoughts on this. Please reach out if you are, but otherwise that is me. Thank you.